All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So start by setting our motivation. So we recollect that we're in this course studying the Lamrim, the systematized sutra teachings of the Buddha, the purpose of which is to present to us the realizations that we ourselves need to cause to dawn in our own minds, to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and accomplish the same result of full enlightenment that the Buddha was able to accomplish. And we think the purpose of that accomplishment isn't for oneself alone. The purpose of that is to create new capacities, new abilities to be able to benefit sentient beings. So we try to develop those minds, strong confidence, and bodhicitta. All right. So last class we looked at the four characteristics, the four features of karma, characterizing both positive and negative karma. Anything that's come up on those four characteristics, questions, thoughts? Okay, so then we'll move into the next section on the 10 non-virtuous actions. So, of course, as it says, these are all focusing in on negative actions, the actions that we ought to avoid. And I think in the first class on this general topic, I mentioned, where this framework comes from, which is the Buddha's direct observation, which makes it difficult. The Lama Zopa in day 179, which is the first contemplation on this section, kind of draws a parallel between the 10 non-virtuous actions and the 10 commandments, because there's 10, right? And they're both religions. But the 10 non-virtuous actions are not a revealed teaching, as I think I mentioned in the first class in this series, this section, where, basically the Buddha was able to track people's, the process of reincarnation, the process by which the mind reincarnates. And by tracking and observing, seeing that this kind of energy results in this sort of experience, in the same way, we don't need, some sort of revealed prophetic statement to help us to, avoid touching a hot stove. Of course, our parents, probably when they were children, they touched a hot stove to verify what their parents told them about not touching a hot stove, and they got that direct experience, and then they passed that on to us, and we probably also verified it, but maybe, or we put our finger in a electric socket because that seemed interesting, I remember, I think it was by accident, but I remember I did both of those. But it wasn't a hot stove. Um, it was the iron. Well, my mother had an iron, um, the old kind of, I guess, I don't remember what, if it was, I think it was this, steam, yeah, steam, but you filled it or something. I don't know if it was, but then it was this metal, and it was on the floor. And my mom had been, I think she put it down because the ironing board was up, but she put, and it maybe it was off, but it had only been off just briefly. So, and I don't remember if I had a thought or not a thought, but I put my whole palm up against the iron, and I had these three like circular, red raised, and I'm pretty sure that my mom had said, never, don't touch the iron. And I probably vocalized, when and she came into the room, and I was so afraid I wouldn't show her. Like, I had my palm clenched. Not that I was beaten as a child, but, I was told not to do it, and I did it. And I didn't want to say that I did something I wasn't, told to do. And so I was like making it worse because I was holding my palm as a fist to not show that I had these three red welts. Um, Also stuck my finger in I can still remember the feeling of the whole body feeling of the electricity. Anyway, point is that, there are things that we can observe are not good. We ought not do them. Um, and that's where this whole framework of virtuous and non-virtuous actions come from, is the Buddha, out of just his kindness and his observation, said, I've observed, I have the ability to observe in a way that ordinary beings don't. And this is my observation. If you, want to avoid these results, don't create these karmic actions. Um, so, you know, um, and as we've talked about, motivation is really the key here. And so Lama Zopa says that all of these 10 non-virtuous actions come from these preconditions in the mind, these mental states in the mind, um, ignorance, anger, and attachment, combined with self-grasping, self-cherishing, and then even, subtler, tertiary, and quadrary kind of combinations of these things, like, greed isn't really, but greed is kind of part, one part attachment, one part ignorance, it's sort of this and so you can combine these different um, states in different ways, and you get different sort of follow-on negative mental states, and these actions flow from these diluted mental states. Uh, so there are 10 in total, 3 of body, 4 of speech, and 3 of mind. So the 3 doors that we've talked about before, the body, the speech, and the mind, the 3 ways in which we create karma. So the 3 of body are to kill, to steal, and to engage in sexual misconduct. The 4 of speech are lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech. And then the 3 of mind are covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. In Day 179, wrong views is translated as heresy, but he also says that a different translation is wrong views. And that's, heresy is quite a loaded term from a Christian, Judeo-Christian perspective. So, wrong views is maybe more neutral. So, and with stealing, I think now, at the time, 2,000 years ago, 2,600, 2,000 years ago, over that time frame when these are all sort of being written down and so on, you probably did, have to physically steal something with that's like you breaking in and you're physically removing something. But of course now stealing with technology and everything has become much more subtle. And you could launch, a program with just your voice and steal something, so it doesn't necessarily, and what you steal is really no longer physical. There were, you actually had to steal coins or gold, and now we just have numbers, that you can steal and trade in different ways. So I feel like stealing has sort of evolved with technology. Um, so he says the three unwholesome actions of the mind are the most harmful because they trigger the other seven, the non-virtues of body and speech. So that's, again, covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. Wrong views is believing anything that, from the Buddhist perspective, anything that the Buddhist perspective would argue is false, to argue that it's true, or the opposite, to argue anything that, from the Buddhist perspective, is considered to be true, and to say that it's false. So whether from the Buddhist perspective it's true or false, if you argue strongly the opposite, then that's holding on to wrong views. So if we don't understand something, or if we're not ready to take something on board as a working hypothesis for our own practice, then we just kind of leave it on the shelf, rather than saying, this is definitely, I'm certain that this is false. If we want to really embrace, Buddhism as a complete path. So he says there's no way to transform the three non-virtues of mind into virtue. It is like trying to transform darkness into light. We can eliminate the darkness by bringing light, but we cannot transform the darkness into light. He says, on the other hand, the three actions of body and the four of speech can be transformed into virtue, depending on the motivation. This is why the Mahayana teachings mainly emphasize mental attitude and non-external actions. So, yeah, so I mean, even killing, with the right motivation, isn't necessarily a non-virtuous action. Now, to a degree, we may have to separate the karma that the person engaging in the action accumulates over against whether it's a skillful action, perfectly or truly, completely skillful action, which would correlate with the result for the other person, or animal, or what have you. If a person internally has a pure enough motivation, they may not accumulate negative karma on the basis of taking a life. However, that separation of body and mind might not work out ideally, or best for that sentient being. So we have to kind of separate those two. And there are also, but then also, very, very high lamas may engage in POA practice, which could speed separation. And they may do that as a person is, nearing their natural death, or an animal. I think Venerable Rabina has talked, about Lama Zopa Rinpoche doing POA practice for animals who were injured, that they drove, and there was an animal on the side of the road that had been hit by a car or something, and or seemed, it was like a bird that had like a very, very badly mangled, and was relatively near, and did POA practice at, just stopped and did it on the side of the road. And that's called the forceful enlightenment, is one way. So the Lama is separating body and mind through a energetic practice. And that is a killing that, if you don't do that, body and mind would remain together for some additional period of time and separate at some other point in time. And you're choosing to cause that to happen earlier. However, it's a very, very high Lama. And so they're doing it because they know that there's only benefit to the mind that's being separated from the body. There's no danger. Whereas, for us, if we have a pure motivation, but we don't know all of the karmic circumstances, then that mind, might have been better off continuing in that incarnation. We lack the ability to know that, but someone like Lama Zopa would be able to distinguish in that way. So then, Lama Zopa says there are, of course, many more types of negative actions we can do than the traditional list of the 10 non-virtuous actions. But this traditional list, he says, gives us the major ones. And by knowing these, we will come to easily differentiate virtue and non-virtue, and then be able to judge each action that we do from morning to night. So this is a framework that we can use to begin to notice, to develop that introspective awareness of, when am I coming under the influence of a negative mental state? When am I motivated to engage in a non-virtuous action? And then even if it's not like we get a pass if it's, because, if it's not technically on this list, it's not like, oh, well, okay, no problem. Like, for example, the proscripted, these are all kind of naturally non-virtuous actions: killing, stealing, lying, sexual. They're all kind of, doesn't really, they get worse if you've taken a vow, but then of course we've talked about proscriptive non-virtues, like not singing and dancing if you've taken a one-day vow. So it isn't to say, oh, well, it's not a non-virtuous action, and so therefore, well, maybe it doesn't really count, or, because it's a proscriptively negative action, given the circumstances, given the fact that you've taken a vow for that one day. And then, of course, even just kind of being, like not being motivated to engage in practice, or kind of not taking our practice seriously. That's not one of these. But we can see, well, why is it that what's arising in my mind? Well, attachment to comfort is arising in my mind. you know, maybe in some cases it could be we were attached to reputation, maybe other people that were around. We don't want to say, oh, hey, I have to go do this thing. It's kind of easier to go along with what other people are doing in a particular time. And so we feel, so this is a framework where we can say, oh, well, but I can notice now that attachment is arising in my mind. And Lama Zopa, also says that non-virtue is kind of anything done under the influence of anger, attachment, or ignorance. So this is also helping us with subtler things that aren't so great. So day 180, again, as I mentioned, Lama Zopa is going to go through. Yeah, Cameron, did you have?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. The first one is the inability to transform a negative state of mind into a virtuous one the same as not being able to purify it?
No. So what he said that applies to, again, just the three of mind. So covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. Just those three mental karmas. What I gather, what he's saying here is that if covetousness arises in the mind, if wrong views arise in the mind, and if ill will arises in the mind, then by definition, the fact that they've arisen in the mind necessarily requires a a not great motivation, a not a, a state of mind that can't ever be considered virtuous, because why would you be coveting in your own mind, coveting something that somebody else owns, but doing it out of a positive place, a positive reason? Why would there be ill will? Just the thought, oh, I hope something bad happens to someone, or something of that sort. How could that arise in the mind if the animating energy was virtue? Um, Whereas we could deceive someone to protect a person's life. Um, Sexual misconduct is a difficult. I don't know that I have any um, examples of um, sexual misconduct, unless it was like um, if a unless it was like going against a person's own, like if it was a monk or a nun, and for some reason they had some like incredibly good reason, so they're not harming the other person in any way, like it's a completely consensual thing, but they have a vow, and but under the circumstances, birthing a child, they've seen some kind of like incredibly beneficial reason to birth a child, um, and so even though they have this vow, maybe they've developed some clairvoyance. I mean, probably better for them to give the vows back first, but um, in terms of the sexual misconduct that actually is harmful to the other person, I can't think of an example where you can transform that into virtue. Um, but yeah, so I mean, in terms of killing, and like with stealing, if someone hasn't given us, if someone is drunk, and they haven't given us their car keys, then technically, if we take their car keys, that is technically stealing. They didn't give it to us, and we don't really have a legal, I mean, I don't know, maybe, I mean, probably they couldn't really complain if they complained to a police officer, the police officer would probably laugh at them, and, probably we wouldn't go to jail. But technically, to steal is to take that which hasn't been given. So if we get in their car and drive it somewhere, or if it's even a little bit stronger than that, like if we know that someone is an alcoholic and they might drink, or we expect that they probably will drink, then we might hide their car keys. We might, and we really have no legal, I mean, but we're doing it with a really good motivation, even though they might not drink. Like they're not drunk yet, but they probably will. So, we can even steal, with a positive motivation. But Lama Zopa is saying that covetousness, ill will, and wrong views couldn't possibly have a virtuous, animating, or motivating energy. Um, any action that's already done, regardless of, um, because if it's a negative action, then we know after it's been done, because it has been done and it was a negative action, we know that the animating energy was non-virtue. So anything after it's been done can be purified, but better to not do it than to do it and then purify it. That's kind of, that they say it's sort of like putting together a broken, clay, plate or something. Yeah, the plate, if you glue it really well and you sand it and you repaint it, yeah, it's going to work as a plate again, but it's not going to be as strong as it was before. Like it's a little bit more prone to being broken again because you're putting it back together. Um, so, ideally, better not to engage in the non-virtue. But the Buddha is very clear that there isn't a non-virtue that can't be purified. But the strength of the antidote may vary. Some there are some negative karmas that are light, that can be easily purified. There are some negative karmas that are incredibly heavy, that in order to purify it requires a very, very strong antidote. And whether we are capable of marshaling that kind of antidote is a separate question. It's technically possible, but it doesn't mean that it's easily done.
The other question I have is, you mentioned that by
I think she's frozen for a second.
sorry, you mentioned that by performing POA, if you're not qualified, that it could be construed as killing. And I'm wondering if as a POA practitioner, and you practice that at the time of your death, that's not considered suicide. I mean, you're not killing yourself, correct?
No, well, so the definition of killing is to intentionally cause body and mind to separate.
Right.
And so it is, you if a animal, like in the example, if an animal is gravely injured, then that animal is in the process of dying. But every living being is in the process of dying. We are in the process of dying. That animal's expiration date is more certain, it's closer. But to know whether or not you should leave that sentient being alone is something that requires wisdom. So, and of course, because it isn't that the great high lamas are just going around and popping everybody that they meet off, using POA, and just people are just dropping, dead. They don't do that, right? So I mean, there's obviously reasons why. I mean, if they could just separate body and mind but because it requires the right kind of karmic conditions, and you know, and so they're not doing that all of the time for just in every circumstance. Um, in terms of if a person feels confident that they themselves, and they've gotten the proper initiations and the proper teachings, and they've practiced it, and they're under the guidance of a master, and then that is a very personal thing, at that point, when to, because it could be, again, are they doing it literally at the time of death, or are they suffering from some sort of really terrible illness that they want to cause that to be shortened? So the circumstances, I would say that it's best to work that out, like when is it appropriate, when isn't it appropriate? Because assuming it works, I mean, I assume then maybe I don't, whether that matters or not, I'm not sure. But in any time that the reason why a person is wanting to separate from this life, if it's because they want to put an end to pain and so on, then that way of thinking is laying down, karmic seeds that are not so ideal. But that's under ordinary circumstances where the result can only be just another ordinary, lifetime where they're going to again still be subject to suffering, still be subject. If they have a high degree of confidence, then, but again, like you also don't see practitioners, teachers recommending that people just, because if you understand POA, then probably and you're really truly highly qualified and able to do it, you may not need to wait. I'm not sure. I don't know that much about POA, so I'm not sure. Could that person just kind of do it whenever they wanted, and just sort of create that, or do they not, or do they need to wait for the winds to be absorbing and all of that to be happening naturally in order for it to be effective? Do those two things have to come together? But if they were a tantric practitioner, maybe they could combine their ability to cause the mind of clear light with the mind of with POA practice. And you don't really find teachers recommending anyone do that, probably because it's more beneficial to continue in that life, engaging in tantric practice and getting all of those imprints again and again and again. Because then, so that kind of thing I think is really personal and would have to be worked out between a teacher and their student, as to like what are the circumstances, when is this beneficial, when is that not beneficial. But anytime that a person intentionally separates body and mind of another sentient being, they did kill it. They had the choice of leaving it alone and letting that separation happen under purely natural circumstances. So it is a killing. But if there's only benefit to the sentient being, then it's no problem. It wasn't a negative action either for that person, and certainly it only benefited that other sentient being. With regard to if POA is sort of unnaturally shortening the, like, it is some sort of intervention, because you do have to do it before body and mind have fully separated. And so it could seem like a similar intervention to giving a drug, or which intervenes and speeds up that process, is that suicide. Suicide is, I think, maybe it's not, or maybe it was Buddhism in a nutshell when I mentioned, from the Buddhist perspective, suicide's not considered a completed act of killing. Maybe it's an incomplete karma of killing, because the person engaging in it can't observe that they succeeded, can't observe the result of the karmic action coming into fruition, because the completion of the act coincides at the moment of body and mind separating, and the cutting off of the continuity of that lifetime. So even suicide by drugs or a gun, or that's not a completed karmic action of killing. But I would say, again, whether there were any possible non-virtuous seeds laid down in the mind through POA practice, I don't know, because even if you end up in a Pure Land, which is the sort of the point of POA practice, is to be forcefully transferred to a Pure Land. It may not. You may still need to take another human rebirth, later, after being in that Pure Land for a time. So you're not necessarily entirely free, or you could be in certain Pure Lands. You could achieve enlightenment in that Pure Land. That's possible. But if not, you may still be under the influence of negative karma. So you may still need to be concerned about any negative karmic seeds that are laid down in the mind. So I think it could be a little bit tricky in terms of when, what is my motivation, and when should I engage in that practice, under what circumstances. And again, that's something that a person would really have to address with the person who taught them POA practice, I would say.
Thank you. A lot to think about.
Okay. Okay, so day 180, Lama Zopa is going to start with talking about the karma of killing. And so the quotation is just one single act of killing results in rebirth in the hell realms. So, and again, of course, that doesn't, that what that means is that that karmic seed is likely to ripen when it ripens, likely to ripen in that kind of rebirth. But of course, we can purify it before it ripens. It's not inevitable that. But again, if we look at the four characteristics, still there was a karmic seed, and under its own power, it will remain in the mind until it bring that results. Till it brings that result. So, and then he goes through, again, what I just alluded to, the what a complete karmic action of killing looks like. So these are, again, four factors. So before we had the four, Buddhism is a philosophy of lists. So, we had the four features or the four characteristics of karma. Here we have the four factors of a completed karma. And these apply to, Lama Zopa here is applying it to an act of killing, but these four factors apply to any karmic act, any complete karmic act. There are complete karmic acts and incomplete karmic acts. If any one of these four factors is absent, then you still did something. It's not like it doesn't exist at all, but it's not a complete karmic act. The only difference really between a completed karmic act and an incompleted karmic act is the power that act can have in terms of the effect that it can bring. Only a complete karmic act has the power to, at the time of death, result in a rebirth in a particular environment, a particular realm. So at the time of death, in order to achieve a human rebirth or an animal realm rebirth, or all of these, that particular karmic seed must be a complete, when it was created, by definition has to have been a completed karmic act. Incomplete karmic acts are insufficiently powerful to lead to that particular result. However, they do ripen you still, you made an effort, you just maybe had one of these four factors absent. So something happened, and there's karma laid down in the mind, and within any given lifetime, an incomplete karma can ripen as an experience that kind of fills out the details of those. Also complete karma. So within a lifetime, complete karmas and incomplete karmas can both ripen, but only a completed karma can throw a mind into a particular type of rebirth. So complete karmas are also sometimes called throwing karmas, because they have the power at the time of death to establish a particular realm, a particular rebirth. So the four factors are the intention, the base, the action, and the completion of the action. The intention, the base, the action, and the completion. So here he says the intention is to kill a sentient being, and the object to be killed, the base, is that sentient being. He says it must be a living being with sentience, with a mind that experiences happiness and suffering. And then you have the act, and then you have the completion of that act. So you have to observe the base, the sentient being. Could be the cockroach on the floor or the mosquito on your arm. You have to observe that sentient being. It gets, of course, everything gets tricky when you, in various use cases. For example, so with that particular use case, looking at that cockroach on that you're motivated, you then develop the intention. You observe the cockroach, and at that time, you could give rise to the intention of scooping it up and relocating it. That's one possible path of action. But you didn't at that. You had aversion in the mind due to attachment. You thought, well, this is my house, this is my kitchen, how dare this gross thing. You're not worried about the cockroach in your neighbor's house. That doesn't bother you. I mean, maybe if you were there you would be grossed out, but at that moment there could be, and there are, billions of cockroaches all across the world, but none of them are bothering you, and you have no ill intent toward any of these billions and billions of cockroaches. You do have ill intent toward the one cockroach in your kitchen, because it's your kitchen. And so you have this strong, you're giving rise to this strong, through attachment, through not wanting to be, experiencing that. And then you think, okay, and still, I mean, strong aversion could still lead to, you can have that and still be like, okay, but I took a vow or something, so I'm gonna muscle through it. I'm gonna get a cup, and I'm gonna, take it. You can do that with strong disgust and so on. But here, the choice that was made as a way of dealing with that revulsion, that was to just take its life, was to do something, to swat it, to spray something, whatever. And then you engage in that action. You go get the device, the poison, the paper towel, or your hand, or a flip flop, or you do something, because in your mind you're like, okay, this is the mechanism that's going to enable me to carry out my intention. This poison, this flip flop, this whatever. This is how I'm going to actually carry out my wish for it to no longer be living. And then you still here, you could stop, you could do something, you could stop yourself, you could be holding the can of whatever, and still you could think, well, no, this is wrong, I should not do that. So you still have to actually engage in the action. You have to depress the lever and spray the thing, or actually engage in the act of hitting, etc. And then it actually has to be completed. If the whatever it is gets out of the way and scurries and is now lost and was unharmed, then you did have all of the factors complete, except the completion, the act of completing it. You saw it, you were averse to it, you wanted to kill it, you thought about a really good way to do it, you went and got that really good way, and you did your best, but it scurried, and it was too fast, and now it seems to be safe. And so assuming that you don't go on a hunt for it, you're not like tearing you're just like, okay, well, it's gone now, like it was a spider or whatever, and like, okay, I don't see it, I'm just gonna let it go. So then that spider is just now happily living its life. That's an incomplete karma of killing, because you made a good faith effort, but you were thwarted due to nothing in your own mind, but due to the dexterity of the sentient being that you tried to kill. So then you have an incomplete karma of killing. And again, similar to suicide, because the mind leaves the body at the same moment that the act was engaged in, there's no completion of the act that's observed by the person engaging in the act. You have to actually observe you have to understand in your mind that the act was completed, and you can't do that with killing yourself. And similarly too, if you miss, but you kill, like maybe there was a butterfly next to the cockroach, and you like butterflies, and it's pretty, and you don't mind that it's in your kitchen, but you accidentally kill the butterfly and not the cockroach. Because you weren't relating to the butterfly, you had no you didn't develop any ill will toward it. There was no, relationship between, it was purely on accident. Again, that's not a completed karmic action. You could say that it's hard to say exactly with that. You did, wasn't that like you didn't do anything, but you didn't observe, you weren't in relation to that sentient being in any way, really. So it still died, and it still died because you engaged in an act, but your act had nothing to do with that sentient being. So I don't know that we can say that it is a completely neutral action, but it's even a much lighter negative karma than had you killed the cockroach, even though they're both insects. We can't talk about it as being as negative as having actually succeeded in killing the cockroach, because it was the cockroach that gave rise to all of your aversion, and it was the cockroach that you wanted to end the life of. So you did still kind of act in an aggressive, kind of reckless manner that didn't have a lot of regard for the sentient beings in your environment. You weren't acting in a peaceful, cooperative, kind of, your mind was disturbed, it was agitated, there was an aggressive sort of action. Similarly, if you shoot at a human and you miss and you kill the person next to them, you should have known better than to open fire, even though that person could be someone that you like, could be someone that you care for, and you didn't in any way want to do anything to harm them. There was agitation, there was anger, and there was aggressive action. And so we can't say it wasn't a negative action, but again, had you succeeded in killing the person that you had the animosity toward, that is a much greater negative karmic action, even though they're both humans and one of them did legitimately die. Karmically speaking, morally, ethically, no difference between the two. Karmically, there is a difference because you have to actually be in relation to the sentient being that you, and legally, of course, no difference. You're still going to prison, for shooting. And but even at trial, we can puzzle through this logically or psychologically as well, because that is a mitigating factor. At trial, you probably wouldn't be put to death for that. Whereas if it was a state that had the death penalty, they'd probably be able to argue, well, it was an accident, like you didn't really. And so the jury probably, you'd go to prison, but you probably wouldn't get the death penalty. Whereas if they could prove that you premeditatively, with malice aforethought, did, then more likely that you would get a stronger. So we even recognize in our society, in our culture, that psychologically that there's a difference there between those two things, even though a person died in both cases. And so the harm is the same, but internally it's not identical. Okay.
I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how far this goes. So say I'm building a 20-story apartment complex and I value engineer the heck out of it. All right. I cut corners. I'm 20 years later, it all comes down, 1,000 people killed. At that point, yeah, it seems to me like, yeah, it probably is.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's hard to, they don't really, in terms of karma, it's always, we always have to be in relation to the sentient being. So of course we knew that we were building a structure meant to be inhabited. But did we actually, so I mean, you could maybe, I think you can make an argument for ill will. You didn't have regard. You acted kind of with a careless disregard for, if people were telling you, oh, hey, there's this regulation and that regulation, and you're ignoring those on purpose, and you're like, oh, but I'll make money and I care more about that. And so there's certainly a callous disregard for human life. But, and of course, you'd have to, in order for it to be complete, you'd have to be alive at that time, and you'd have to be made aware that they died, because that's, otherwise, maybe you, so if you died before that happened, or if you even just never knew about it, like you moved to a different country and you never heard about it, then you wouldn't have a complete karma. I mean, I guess it would. So certainly it would be negative. Um, and it could be that if someone said to you, like a person in authority, architect, or if someone said, if you do this, it's very likely that people will die, then that would be different than like just kind of someone who didn't really know what they were doing or didn't bother to investigate thoroughly, didn't really want to know exactly what. So it kind of would depend on what they were told and what assumptions they were operating under. But I think probably if someone, if the architect said, if you make me do this, I can assure you that this structure will fail and people will lose their life, and then they said, go ahead anyway, then that probably would be the karma of killing.
Wow. Yeah.
And then also Lama Zopa indicates that we're not off the hook if we instruct, kind of like through that example, or like in a war or something, or like with a hitman, we're not off the hook if we instruct someone else to kill on our behalf. If we're clear about it, if we say, I want you to go kill that person, I want you to, invade. And here the object or the basis, it is a little bit more flexible than actually observing the specific sentient being, if we're clear enough in our mind about who qualifies as the basis. So, if a person goes into a grocery store and they're indiscriminately and intentionally so, like they're just opening fire, then that's happening in a grocery store. It's not happening next door. It's not happening in another town. It's happening in that place and time. And so all sentient beings in that place and time are the basis. And the goal is, I just want to kill as many persons as exist in this place and time as I can. And so whomever then is killed constitutes the basis of that action. And so like, because if you invade a particular country, it's that particular country that you are. So if you're directing, the other country is totally safe, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, no one's messing with them, but you're invading this country. So whomever dies in that country is the basis, because that was the, so the universe of possible sentient beings isn't necessarily like, you don't have to see a picture, or they don't have to be like in front of you, where it could be that you've decided that that army, anyone in that army is the enemy, and therefore they are all the basis of my action. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. So we'll just end with dedicating. So we'll recollect our motivation and think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind. And think that we freely offer the fruit of our practice, that positive energy, for the benefit of all sentient beings, without exception. And bring to mind those that lost their lives in the submarine accident, and all beings in the Bardo.